Lost in the LA wildfires, this cat's miraculous reunion with his owner. The sun rose over the Los Angeles hills, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and gold. Birds chirped and a light breeze rustled through the trees. Everything felt calm and peaceful. Margaret Maggie Lawson, an 82-year-old retired schoolteacher with kind eyes and silver hair, stepped onto her front porch with a warm cup of coffee cradled in her hands. She breathed in the crisp morning air, savoring the quiet. Beside her, stretched out in the sunlight, was her beloved cat Whiskers. His fluffy Maine Coon fur shimmered in the golden light as his tail flicked lazily. She reached down, scratching him gently behind the ears. "You and me, Whiskers, always." Whiskers purred in response, pressing his head into her hand. It was their morning ritual. Coffee for Maggie, sunbathing for Whiskers. Life had a comforting rhythm, one they both cherished. Inside their cozy home, the smell of old books and fresh bread filled the air. The living room was filled with warm memories, family photos, handmade quilts, and stacks of novels Maggie had read countless times. She sat in her favorite armchair knitting a scarf while Whiskers lay beside her on the couch, playfully swiping at the ball of yarn. She chuckled, pulling the yarn away from his mischievous paws. "Oh, you think this is a game, huh? You little troublemaker." Whiskers rolled onto his back, his big green eyes staring up at her with innocent amusement. Maggie smiled, shaking her head. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, making the curtains flutter. Later that afternoon, Maggie hummed softly as she scooped a generous portion of tuna into Whiskers' bowl. "Here you go, sir. A fine meal for the best cat in town." Whiskers trotted over his tail high in the air. He rubbed against her legs before digging into his meal. Maggie watched him with affection, enjoying the simple joy of their companionship. The gentle background noise of the TV suddenly shifted. The cheerful music was replaced by a serious voice. Maggie turned her head toward the screen, her expression changing. "Breaking news! A fire warning has been issued for the Los Angeles hills. Dry weather and strong winds are creating dangerous conditions. Residents should be prepared to evacuate." Maggie's heart clenched. She glanced out the window. The sky was still clear, the sun still shining, yet an unease settled in her chest. It wasn't the first fire warning she had heard over the years, but something about this one felt different. She turned toward Whiskers, who continued eating blissfully unaware. "It's just a warning," she murmured to herself. "No need to worry yet." She switched off the TV and took a deep breath, pushing the worry away. But outside, the wind had begun to pick up. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in fiery shades of pink and orange, Maggie and Whiskers sat together on the porch once again. Whiskers lay curled up on the wooden railing, his fur illuminated by the evening light. Maggie ran her fingers through his soft coat, enjoying the moment. But then something changed. Whiskers' ears perked up. His body stiffened. He lifted his head, staring into the distance, completely still. Maggie followed his gaze, but all she saw was the vast stretch of land and the quiet hills beyond. "What is it, boy?" Whiskers didn't move. His tail flicked once, then twice. Maggie squinted, trying to see what had caught his attention. And then she saw it. A thin wisp of smoke, curling into the sky, barely visible against the sunset. A chill ran down her spine. She swallowed, brushing it off. Fires happened often. It was probably nothing to worry about. She sighed and leaned back in her chair, but Whiskers stayed alert, his eyes locked on the horizon. The wind blew a little stronger. The air felt heavier. Something was coming. The wind howled through the hills, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke. Maggie stood on her porch, her silver hair whipping around her face as she squinted at the horizon. The thin wisp of smoke she had seen earlier had grown into a dark, ominous cloud, blotting out the sun. The air felt heavy, and the birds had gone silent. Whiskers, usually so calm and composed, paced back and forth on the porch, his tail twitching nervously. His green eyes darted toward the smoke, and he let out a low, uneasy meow. "It's okay, boy," Maggie said, trying to sound reassuring, but her voice trembled. She reached down to stroke his fur, but he dodged her hand and his ears flattened against his head. The sound of sirens pierced the air, growing louder by the second. Maggie's heart raced as she stepped back, inside her mind racing. She turned on the TV, flipping to the local news channel. The screen showed a map of the area, with a bright red zone marking the fire's path. The reporter's voice was urgent. The wildfire is spreading rapidly due to strong winds. Residents in the following areas must evacuate immediately: Laurel Canyon, Nichols Canyon, and all surrounding neighborhoods. If you are in these areas, do not delay. Gather your essentials and leave now. Maggie's hands shook as she grabbed her phone. A text alert flashed on the screen. Mandatory evacuation. Leave immediately. Oh no, she whispered. Her eyes darted around the room, trying to decide what to take. She grabbed her purse, her medication, and a few photo albums. Then she remembered Whiskers. Whiskers, she called, her voice cracking. Where are you? She found him hiding under the couch, his wide eyes reflecting her fear. Come on, boy, we have to go. She reached for him, but he backed away, his fur bristling. The sound of the sirens grew louder, and the smell of smoke was now overpowering. Maggie's chest tightened as she coughed. She grabbed Whiskers' carrier from the closet and set it on the floor. Please, Whiskers, get in. We don't have much time. But Whiskers wasn't listening. The noise and the smell had sent him into a panic. He darted out from under the couch and bolted toward the back door. Maggie lunged for him, but he slipped through her fingers. Whiskers, no, she cried, stumbling after him. Outside, the world had turned into chaos. The sky was a sickly orange, and ash rained down like snow. The wind roared, carrying with it the crackling sound of flames. Maggie coughed as she ran after Whiskers, her eyes stinging from the smoke. Whiskers, come back, she shouted, her voice barely audible over the wind. Whiskers was a blur of fur darting between bushes and disappearing into the thick haze. Maggie pushed forward, her heart pounding. She tripped over a rock, scraping her knee, but she barely noticed the pain. All she could think about was Whiskers. Please, boy, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Don't leave me. The heat was unbearable now. Flames licked at the dry grass, devouring everything in their path. Maggie's lungs burned as she struggled to breathe. She could barely see through the smoke, but she kept going, driven by sheer desperation. Ma'am, a voice shouted. Maggie turned to see a firefighter running toward her, his face obscured by a mask. You need to leave now, it's not safe. My cat, Maggie gasped, pointing toward the haze. He ran off. I can't leave him. The firefighter hesitated, his eyes darting toward the flames. We'll do our best to find him, but you have to go, now. Maggie shook her head, her vision blurring with tears. I can't leave him. The firefighter grabbed her arm, his grip firm but gentle. I'm sorry, ma'am, but if you stay here, you'll die. We'll look for your cat, I promise. Maggie's legs gave out and she sank to the ground, sobbing. The firefighter helped her to her feet and led her toward a waiting truck. She looked back one last time, hoping to see Whiskers emerge from the smoke. But there was nothing. As the truck drove away, Maggie clutched her hands together, whispering, Please, Whiskers, be safe. Whiskers ran blindly, his heart pounding in his chest. The noise, the smoke, the heat, it was all too much. His instincts screamed at him to find safety. But where could he go? He darted under a bush, his fur bristling as he tried to catch his breath. The ground beneath him was hot and the air was thick with smoke. He coughed, his small body trembling with fear. Maggie, he mowed softly, his voice barely audible over the roar of the flames. But Maggie wasn't there. He was alone. The sound of crackling flames grew louder and Whiskers knew he couldn't stay. He bolted from the bush, his paws burning as he ran across the scorched ground. The world around him was a blur of orange and black, and the heat was unbearable. He stumbled into a small ditch, his body collapsing from exhaustion. The flames were closing in, and Whiskers knew he didn't have much time. He closed his eyes, his mind filled with images of Maggie. Her gentle hands, her soothing voice, the way she always made him feel safe. I have to survive, he thought, his instincts kicked in. For Maggie. With a burst of energy, Whiskers pushed himself up and began to run again. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he couldn't stop. The flames were everywhere, but he kept moving, driven by sheer willpower. Maggie sat on a cot in the evacuation shelter, her hands trembling as she held a cup of water. The room was filled with other evacuees, their faces pale and drawn. Some were crying, Others sat in stunned silence. The air was thick with tension and despair. A volunteer approached Maggie, her voice gentle. "Ma'am, is there anything I can get for you?" Maggie shook her head, her eyes distant. "My cat. He's out there. I couldn't save him." The volunteer's face softened. "I'm so sorry. The firefighters are doing everything they can. There's still hope." Maggie nodded, but her heart felt heavy. She couldn't stop thinking about Whiskers. His soft fur, his playful antics, the way he always seemed to know when she needed comfort. "He's strong," she whispered, more to herself than to the volunteer. "He'll find his way back to me." Whiskers wandered through the charred landscape, his body weak and his spirit battered. The fire had left nothing but destruction in its wake. Trees were reduced to blackened skeletons, and the ground was covered in ash. He found a small stream and drank greedily the cool water, soothing his parched throat. His stomach growled, but there was no food in sight. He had to keep moving. Days turned into nights and Whiskers kept going. He avoided other animals, his instincts telling him they were just as desperate as he was. He scavenged for scraps, finding bits of charred food here and there. It wasn't much, but it kept him alive. One night, as he curled up in the hollow of a burnt-out tree, he thought of Maggie. He could almost feel her hands stroking his fur, and hear her voice calling his name. "I'll find you, Maggie," he thought, his eyes closing as exhaustion took over. "I promise." The days blurred together for Whiskers. The once familiar hills were now a barren wasteland, scorched and lifeless. The fire had taken everything, the trees, the grass, even the birds. The only sounds were the occasional crackle of embers and the distant howl of the wind. Whiskers' paws were raw and blistered from walking across the hot, uneven ground. His fur, once thick and glossy, was now matted with ash and dirt. He was hungry, thirsty, and exhausted, but he refused to give up. Every step was a battle, but he kept moving, driven by the memory of Maggie's voice and the warmth of her touch. One afternoon, he stumbled upon the remains of a house. The walls were charred and the roof had collapsed, but it offered some shelter from the relentless sun. Whiskers crept inside his ears, twitching as he listened for danger. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and burnt wood, but it was cooler here and the ground was softer. He found a corner that was relatively untouched by the flames and curled up his body, trembling with exhaustion. His stomach growled, but there was no food in sight. He closed his eyes, trying to ignore the hunger gnawing at him. Maggie thought his mind was drifting to her. "Where are you?" Maggie sat at a small desk in the corner of the shelter, her hands shaking as she filled out a missing pet form. The room was buzzing with activity, volunteers handing out food, children crying, and people talking in hushed tones. But Maggie felt like she was in a bubble, cut off from the world around her. She stared at the form, her vision blurring with tears. The line for Pet's name was easy, Whiskers, but the rest was harder. Last seen location, distinctive features, contact information. Each word felt like a dagger to her heart. A volunteer approached a kind-looking woman with a gentle smile. "Ma'am, can I help you with that?" Maggie looked up, her eyes red and swollen. I don't know what to write. He's out there somewhere, and I don't know how to find him." The volunteer sat down beside her, her voice soft. "Tell me about him." Maggie took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she spoke. "His name is Whiskers. He's a Maine Coon, big and fluffy. He has green eyes and a white patch on his chest. He's my best friend." The volunteer nodded, her eyes filled with sympathy. "We'll do everything we can to find him. But you need to take care of yourself, too. Have you eaten today?" Maggie shook her head. "I can't eat, not until I know he's safe." The volunteer placed a hand on Maggie's shoulder. "I understand, but you need to stay strong, for him." Maggie nodded, though her heart felt heavy. She finished filling out the form and handed it to the volunteer. "Please, find him." Whiskers woke to the sound of rustling leaves. His ears perked up and he lifted his head, and his senses on high alert. The sound was coming from outside the ruined house. He crept to the doorway, his body low to the ground. Through the haze, he saw a small rabbit nibbling on a patch of grass that had somehow survived the fire. Whiskers' stomach growled and his instincts kicked in. He moved slowly, his eyes locked on the rabbit. Every muscle in his body was tense, ready to pounce. But just as he was about to strike, the rabbit bolted, disappearing into the smoke. Whiskers let out a frustrated meow, his shoulders slumping. He was too weak and too slow. He needed food, but it seemed like the world was against him. He wandered back into the house, his tail dragging on the ground. He found a small puddle of water in a corner and lapped at it, the cool liquid soothing his parched throat. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him going. Days turned into weeks, and Maggie refused to give up. She spent every waking moment searching for Whiskers. She posted flyers in every shelter, every vet clinic, and every community center. She called rescue organizations, begging them to keep an eye out for him. She even started a social media campaign, sharing his photo and story with anyone who would listen. The response was overwhelming. Strangers from all over the city reached out, offering words of encouragement and sharing her posts. Donations poured in, enough to cover the cost of flyers, ads, and even a reward for Whiskers' safe return. But as the days passed, Maggie's hope began to waver. She lay in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, her mind filled with questions. Was Whiskers still alive? Was he scared? Was he thinking of her? One night she dreamed of him. He was sitting on her porch, his green eyes glowing in the sunlight. She reached out to touch him, but he vanished, leaving her alone in the darkness. She woke up crying, her heart aching with loss. But even in her despair, she held on to one thought. Whiskers is strong. He'll find his way back to me. Whiskers had lost track of time. The days and nights blended together, each one harder than the last. But he refused to give up. He kept moving, driven by the faint hope that he would find Maggie again. One day he stumbled upon a familiar scent. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The smell of home. He followed it, his heart pounding with excitement. The scent led him to a small clearing where the remains of a garden stood. It was Maggie's garden. The flowers were gone, the soil scorched, but the memory was still there. Whiskers sat in the middle of the clearing, his eyes closed as he breathed in the familiar scent. Maggie thought his heart was swelling with hope. I'm coming home. Maggie was sitting in the shelter's common area, scrolling through her phone when she saw a post from a local animal rescue group. They had found a cat matching Whiskers' description in the burned-out hills. Her heart raced as she read the post. The cat was thin and injured but alive. They had scanned his microchip and confirmed his identity. It was Whiskers. Tears streamed down Maggie's face as she called the number listed in the post. Her hands shook so badly she could barely dial. Hello, a voice answered. This is Maggie Lawson, she said, her voice trembling. You found my cat? You found Whiskers. The shelter was a cacophony of barks, meows, and the occasional squawk of a bird. Maggie stood at the front desk, her heart pounding in her chest. The receptionist smiled warmly and led her to a small room. Wait here, she said. We'll bring him in. Maggie nodded, her hands trembling. She clutched the flyer she had made, the one with Whiskers' picture and the words missing in bold letters. She had handed out hundreds of them, posted them on every bulletin board, and shared them online. The door creaked open, and a vet assistant walked in carrying a small carrier. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. Here he is, the assistant said, gently placing the carrier on the table. Maggie knelt down, her eyes filled with tears. Inside the carrier, curled up in a ball, was Whiskers. His once lustrous fur was matted and his body thin and frail, but his eyes, those big green eyes, were the same. Whiskers, she whispered, her voice breaking. The cat lifted his head, his ears twitching. He let out a weak, raspy meow. Maggie opened the carrier and reached her hands, trembling. Whiskers hesitated for a moment, then slowly, painfully crawled into her arms. He nuzzled against her chest, his purr a faint rumble. I knew you'd come back to me, she said, tears streaming down her face. I never stopped believing. The days that followed were a blur of vet visits, medications, and sleepless nights. Whiskers was weak and malnourished, his body covered in burns and cuts. But with Maggie by his side, he began to heal. The vet, a kind woman named Dr. Patel, explained the extent of Whiskers' injuries. He's been through a lot, she said, her voice was gentle. But he's strong. With proper care, he'll make a full recovery. Maggie nodded her eyes, never leaving Whiskers. "Whatever it takes," she said firmly. "I'll do whatever it takes." She spent every moment with him, feeding him small meals, cleaning his wounds, and whispering words of encouragement. Slowly but surely, Whiskers began to regain his strength. His fur grew back, his cuts healed, and his purr became louder and more confident. News of Maggie and Whiskers' reunion spread quickly. The story of the elderly woman and her brave cat touched the hearts of people all over the city. Donations poured in, enough to cover Whiskers' medical bills, and even help Maggie find a new home. One day, as Maggie sat with Whiskers in the shelter's common area, a young girl approached her. She was holding a handmade card, her eyes wide with admiration. "Is this Whiskers?" she asked, pointing to the cat in Maggie's lap. Maggie smiled and nodded. "Yes, this is Whiskers." The girl handed her the card. "I made this for you. I'm so glad you found him." Maggie opened the card, her eyes filling with tears. Inside was a drawing of a cat and a woman surrounded by hearts. Beneath it, in childish handwriting, were the words, "Love never gives up." "Thank you," Maggie said, her voice choked with emotion. "This means so much to me." With the help of the community, Maggie and Whiskers moved into a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't the home they had lost, but it was warm and safe, and that was enough. Maggie spent her days tending to Whiskers, who was slowly but surely returning to his old self. He still had scars, both physical and emotional, but he was happy. He spent his days lounging in the sun, playing with his toys, and curling up in Maggie's lap. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Maggie sat on the balcony with Whiskers in her arms. The sky was painted in shades of pink and orange, just like it had been on that fateful day. "We made it, boy," she said, stroking his fur. "We made it through the flames." Whiskers purred, his eyes half closed in contentment. He nuzzled against her chest, his heart beating in sync with hers. Maggie smiled, a sense of peace settling over her. They had lost their home, but they had each other, and in the end, that was all that mattered. Maggie and Whiskers' story became a symbol of resilience and hope. They appeared on local news, sharing their journey and raising awareness about wildfire preparedness and pet safety. Maggie wrote a book about their experience, with all proceeds going to animal rescue organizations. Whiskers became a local celebrity, with his picture adorning posters and social media posts. People would stop Maggie on the street to ask about him, and she would proudly tell his story. Though the scars of the fire remained both physical and emotional, Maggie and Whiskers found solace in their unbreakable bond. They had faced the flames and emerged stronger, a testament to the power of love and hope. And as they sat together watching the sun set over the hills, Maggie knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Always. The small apartment was modest but cozy, filled with the warm glow of sunlight streaming through the windows. Boxes were still stacked in the corners, waiting to be unpacked. But Maggie had already set up the essentials: her favorite armchair, a soft blanket for Whiskers, and a small bookshelf filled with her most cherished novels. Whiskers sat on the windowsill, his green eyes half closed as he basked in the sunlight. His fur, once matted and signed, had grown back thick and glossy. The scars on his paws were still visible, but they were a testament to his resilience, a reminder of what he had survived. Maggie watched him from the kitchen with a soft smile on her face. She was making tea, the familiar routine bringing her a sense of calm. The past few months had been a whirlwind of emotions, but now, in this quiet moment, she felt at peace. "How's my brave boy doing?" She asked me to set the teacup on the table. Whiskers turned his head, his ears twitching at the sound of her voice. He let out a soft meow and jumped down from the windowsill, padding over to her. He rubbed against her legs, his purr a gentle rumble. Maggie knelt down, scratching him behind the ears. "You've come so far, haven't you?" "We both have." Whiskers' recovery had been slow but steady. The burns on his paws had healed, and the cuts on his side were now faint scars. He still had moments of fear. Loud noises or the smell of smoke could send him hiding under the bed. But Maggie was always there to comfort him. She had learned to read his moods, to know when he needed space and when he needed cuddles. She spent hours brushing his fur, the rhythmic motions soothing for both of them. And every night she would sit with him on the couch, watching old movies and reminiscing about their life before the fire. Remembering our old house, she asked one evening, her fingers running through his fur. The garden, the porch, the way the sunlight used to filter through the trees. It was beautiful, wasn't it? Whiskers purred, his eyes half closed. He didn't understand her words, but he understood the love behind them. Maggie and Whiskers' story had touched the hearts of people far and wide. Donations had poured in enough to cover their medical bills and help them start anew. Strangers sent letters and gifts, sharing their own stories of loss and hope. One day, a package arrived at their door. Maggie opened it to find a handmade quilt, each square embroidered with a message of encouragement. "Stay strong," one square read. "Love never gives up," said another. Tears filled Maggie's eyes as she ran her fingers over the quilt. "Look at this, Whiskers," she said, holding it up for him to see. "People care about us. They really do." Whiskers sniffed the quilt, his tail flicking curiously. He didn't understand its significance, but he could sense Maggie's emotions. He nuzzled against her hand and purred with a comforting presence. Life settled into a new routine. Maggie spent her mornings tending to the small balcony garden she had started, planting flowers and herbs in pots. Whiskers would sit nearby, watching her with curious eyes. "You're my little supervisor, aren't you?" she teased, sprinkling water on the plants. "Making sure I do everything just right." Whiskers meowed in response, his tail swishing lazily. In the afternoons, they would take short walks around the neighborhood. Whiskers wore a harness and leash, his head held high as he explored the new surroundings. Maggie walked slowly, her hand resting on his back, guiding him. "Look at you," she said one day as they passed a group of children playing in the park. "You're such a brave boy. Everyone admires you, you know." Whiskers purred, his green eyes sparkling with pride. One afternoon there was a knock at the door. Maggie opened it to find a familiar face, the firefighter who had helped her evacuate on that fateful day. Ms. Lawson asked, his voice hesitant. "I don't know if you remember me, but—" "Of course I remember you," Maggie interrupted, her eyes filling with tears. "You saved my life." The firefighter smiled, his eyes soft with emotion. "I heard about Whiskers. I just wanted to come by and see how you both were doing." Maggie stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. "We're doing well, thanks to people like you." Whiskers padded over, his tail held high. He sniffed the firefighter's boots, his ears twitching. "Hey there, buddy," the firefighter said, crouching down to scratch Whiskers behind the ears. "You're looking good." Whiskers purred, leaning into the touch. Maggie watched them, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Maggie and Whiskers' story continued to inspire others. They were invited to speak at community events, sharing their journey of resilience and hope. Maggie wrote a book about their experience, with all proceeds going to animal rescue organizations. One day, as they sat together on the balcony, Maggie read aloud from the final chapter of her book. "The fire took our home, but it couldn't take our love. Whiskers and I faced the flames together, and we emerged stronger. We learned that even in the darkest times, there is always hope. And as long as we have each other, we can face anything." Whiskers purred, his eyes half closed in contentment. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the love behind them. As the sun set over the city, Maggie and Whiskers sat together on the balcony, the sky painted in shades of pink and orange. The air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers and the distant hum of the city. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Maggie said, stroking Whiskers' fur. "But this is just the beginning. We have so much more to look forward to." Whiskers nuzzled against her chest, his purr a gentle rumble. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. As long as he was with Maggie, he was home. Maggie smiled, a sense of peace settling over her. They had lost their home, but they had each other, and in the end, that was all that mattered.